Welcome. It's great to see so many people joining. We're just going to give it a second so that everyone can filter in. Well, I am delighted to welcome you to our program today, a curator's talk on Richard Benson. My name is Lynnea West. I work in public programs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The Philadelphia Museum of Art recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples, a long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements displaced many Lenape from this land. This museum and our staff strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape peoples, past and present, including the federally recognized nations, Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors past and present by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to this program today. Today we are joined by Sarah Meister and Peter Barberie for a conversation on the photographer Richard Benson. Sarah Meister is the Executive Director of Aperture. Aperture is a not-for-profit foundation, a publisher, and a center for the photo community. Previously, she was a longtime curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Peter Barberie is the Brodsky Curator of Photographs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he's the curator of the exhibition, Richard Benson, The World is Smarter Than You Are. So it's fantastic to have both of you with us here today.
Thank you, Lynnea.
Thanks, Lynnea.
Thank you both for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So Richard Benson, The World is Smarter Than You Are, is on view at the Philadelphia Museum of Art through January 23rd. And if you haven't seen it yet, you will certainly be primed to do so after this conversation. Peter is going to start by telling us a little bit about the exhibition and Benson, and then Sarah will join him for a conversation, altogether lasting about 40 minutes. We're saving time at the end for your questions, and I hope you have many. So I just have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Like I said, we're saving time at the end for questions. Please share your questions and comments via the Q&A box. It has the helpful upvote feature. So if you see a question you like from someone else, you can give it a thumbs up. It'll go to the top of the queue. And those are the questions we'll answer first when we get to Q&A. The chat is also open. A lot of people are sharing where they're tuning in from. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from. So please do feel free to share. This program is closed captioned, and you can turn those captions on or off by clicking the CC button in your Zoom toolbar. And finally, we're recording today's program. After the program, we're going to send an email out to everyone who registered with a link to the recording, so you can look back at anything we talk about today. All that said, Peter, I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lynnea, and hello, everybody. Welcome to the Philadelphia Museum of Art virtually today. We're glad to have so many of you with us. I am pleased to be joined by my friend, Sarah Meister, who was at the Museum of Modern Art in the years when Richard Benson worked on several projects there. As Lynnea told us, Sarah now leads Aperture, where Benson also left a remarkable legacy. Richard Benson is truly a great figure in the history of photography, but he is not well known outside of a tight-knit circle of admirers. And that's the first reason for the exhibition we've organized here, is to just bring his whole career forward with its many facets. In our conversation today, my conversation with Sarah is meant to open some doors onto that remarkable achievement by him. I'm showing you here two portraits of Benson made 28 years apart. The one on the left made more recently by Harvey Wang, and then a younger version of Richard in 1984 by his friend Lee Friedlander. Both of these portraits show Benson at home in Newport, Rhode Island. Home and family were not a separate sphere for Benson from his art. His workshop was attached to his house, the house you see him in here in both pictures, and his home life was all wrapped up with everything he made and did. That's one of the his unique qualities, I think, as a contemporary artist. Both of these photographs capture his frank personality and his craftsman-like outlook on the world. He usually looked something like this. He was ready for work in almost every context. Benson, in terms of his art, he privileged making things above all other aspects of art. So the actual challenges and problems of physically making things were really what occupied him the most in his life, in his working life. Now, today, Benson is best known for his accomplishments as a printer, especially of photography books and prints for other artists. And he's also very well known as a teacher. He taught for many years at Yale University, and he was the dean of its School of Art from 1996 until 2006. And Benson's influence as a teacher is the subject of Aperture's forthcoming book, Object Lesson, which we are very much looking forward to seeing, Sarah, in a few months when it comes out.
I am too. All signs are looking great. I'm just not quite ready yet, but it's coming. Worth the wait.
Good. Well, there is a related exhibition, I should say, for those of you who are going to get to Philadelphia at Tilt Institute, our wonderful fellow institution in the city. They have a show right now called Richard Benson Object Lesson, with work by around 30 artists who studied with Benson or who were influenced by him. So it's a great moment to look at his career. Could I have the next slide, please, Steve? Sarah and I both knew Benson. Sarah knew him a bit longer than I did. And we obviously both care deeply about his work, but we have joked with each other several times that we are far from Benson experts. So I just wanted to clear the air because I imagine there may be some people who really worked with him much longer than we did.
I'm scrolling through the attendees and that's definitely true. So good to acknowledge up front.
So we're really glad that you're all here. Chime in if we get something horribly wrong. And you know, we're here in a spirit of real love for what Richard Benson did in his life and also for the person that he was. He was an amazing man. Now, I just spoke about Benson's fame as a printer and a teacher, and those are the things he is best known for today. However, Richard Benson also made photographs like these two pictures that you have here. These are both in our exhibition. And I think these are sort of magical pictures, I have to say. They're both made with a large format view camera, which is the device he chose to use for much of his career until an amazing turn late in life that we'll see later. And he, first of all, he really cared about natural light and how it shaped a scene, but also how it shaped his memory of the experience of making the picture. And both of these pictures are filled with beautiful natural light. I think also the portrait on the left of the young man who is his nephew, Christopher Benson, also an artist, is just extraordinary, both because it frames him in a scene that Benson would have cared about a lot, which is a sort of leftover industrial world of the Northeastern United States. But it also, I think in a really empathetic way, captures what a young man of say about 20 or 22, which I'm guessing was the age of Christopher then, sort of where he would be in the world and what his outlook would be. And that empathy, Richard brought that, I think, to all of his work. And to me, that's very important. So the exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art actually centers Richard's photographs. They are the center of the exhibition, the focus of it. And we really want to place them at the center of his achievements as a printer and a teacher. This is the first survey of Benson's photography that has happened. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2017, so he's not here to see it, but this is the first survey of his whole life's work. It covers almost 50 years of his photography. The exhibition comprises 100 photographs framed on the walls, and there are also 8 large cases throughout the show that include materials from many of his other projects, including a number of the books that he worked on. Could I, next slide, please? So because books and teaching were so important to him, we will start with some conversation about those things. And I'm showing you here the exterior of a monumental book that Benson really largely conceived, although he had many great collaborators, and produced in the 1980s. This is a book of reproductions of other people's photographs, many of them from the 19th century. So you're really going to get a flavor of Benson's outlook and his sensibility. Benson believed that there was as much genius in printing work and in making reproductions like the one you see here as there was in the art of photography itself. And he was, I think, unique among his peers in having that outlook, and it really informed all of his work. So this book started as a conversation with the curator Pierre Apraxine and the collector Howard Gilman. They wanted to make reproductions, really excellent, superb reproductions of the photographs that they had collected for the Gilman Paper Company corporate collection, one of the most important photography collections ever assembled. Today it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for those of you who can get there. And one conversation led to another among Apraxine and Gilman and Benson, and eventually they decided to make a book which would reproduce these very fragile and rare prints in exquisite detail and in most cases at the actual size of the original print. Now that might not sound too challenging, but it was an immense undertaking. There are 1,200 copies of the book. I'm forgetting the number of plates, but well over 200 plates in the book. And Benson and Thomas Palmer, who worked with him on this, would print each sheet, such as the one you see here, up to 6 times in order to reproduce the tonality of whatever image they were working with. The one I show here, I picked it because it's a Philadelphia picture, a great Philadelphia daguerreotype by the Langenheim brothers from the 1840s. It depicts one of them, Frederick Langenheim, and it's actually a daguerreotype, the original. So it's an entirely different thing than a sheet of paper. It's a cased metal object. But
Peter, would you pause 1 second? Also, I think what might not register in this is the scale of the book and the original and the relation between.
Thank you.
Like I'm just,
yeah.
Okay, just I'm listening and I'm thinking to myself, if I didn't know, I'd be curious.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I showed you the book on the left because it's not just a regular book. It's actually an elephant folio. It's very large. It's almost 3 feet high or over 2 feet high as a book. So it's a monumental thing filled with these really beautiful reproductions. And the reason I'm going on about it is that Benson and Palmer and others devoted so much attention and care to every single print in the book. And they were using a very workaday process. They were using offset lithography. But Benson, who really came to making photography through books, tinkered with the process for a long time in order to create almost an artisanal version of the offset process, and then would make these prints multiple times. Sarah, do you want to add anything here, or I can?
But it's just, it is just a master thing to behold, and it looks beautiful in the exhibition, the way you've displayed it, so you really get a sense of the achievement, which it really, and it's also just such an insane endeavor to be, to do this. It was just very, very difficult, and it looks seamless because that's what difficult things done well, how they appear, but it's an amazing thing.
Let's go to the next slide, please, which shows us another project. I'll just say, I mentioned that Richard came to photography through printing and through books, and I should explain that in 1966, he started working at what was then a very well-regarded printing firm, Meriden Gravure in Meriden, Connecticut, which was a company that was known for its fine books, especially its fine art books. And one of his jobs, sort of an entry-level position, was to make reproduction photographs. He would photograph works of art, and then those photographs were going to be translated into ink reproductions for the books that the company was printing. And this experience, in his own words, really made him interested in the history of photography. So he started with the kind of workman-like needs of making reproductions. He was fascinated by all the challenges, the technical challenges of that work. But then he was sparked to care about the history of photography, and he started going out and meeting artists. He told me that he looked up Paul Caponegro and went to visit him, for instance, to just talk about the medium. And when I said earlier that he saw genius in both, that's what I mean. He was equally galvanized by the technical challenges of reproductions and by the art of photography. And that dual track really informed everything that followed, as we just saw with the Gilman book, and also with this amazing project, the printed picture. Now, the book you're seeing was published by the Museum of Modern Art in 2008. As Sarah reminded me the other day, this book started as a series of lectures. It then became a book, and then it became an exhibition. And Sarah, you worked on this a little bit.
I did. This was really how, I guess the formality of getting to know Richard at MoMA perhaps meant that's why I call him Richard and not Chip, like everyone else seems to do. But he was working on this with him was just an extraordinary opportunity. I don't know what I was at the time, maybe an assistant curator, maybe an associate curator, something like that. But he made he has a very open, and his teaching style fed into every aspect of this. So you always felt like you were his partner, you were learning alongside him. And for the show that's now at Tilt, and the book that Aperture is publishing that's going to be called Object Lesson, a lot of people, myself included, reflected on what it meant to work with or get to know Richard Benson. What was an object lesson that one drew from that experience? And for me, it was understanding the way in which your life and your priorities that are rooted in your life can feed into your work in a way that I had never previously grasped as completely as I did through him. And this was in the printed picture. There's a wedding picture of his beautiful young bride, Barbara, made at Baccarat Studios. And she was clearly unhappy about such a formal setting to have. She would have clearly much rather had Richard been making her picture. To a letter that one of his ancestors wrote very frugally on a piece of paper in two directions, once across and then turning it 90 degrees and again. And it's astounding. If you have good handwriting, try it. It's a perfectly legible letter, but you don't waste a sheet of paper if you can write on each side twice, once vertical and once at a 90-degree angle. And personally, for me, this show, the printed picture begins with cave paintings, with the idea of what a handprint or a stencil on a cave wall would have been. But to illustrate this in the exhibition, Richard said to me, well, Sarah, you have young kids. Why don't you just make some handprints with them? And
let's go to the next slide.
Oh, do we have a picture of it? Great. Oh, look. So there on the far left, one of the few things that my children ever thought was interesting that I did was bringing their handprints at Richard's invitation onto the same wall as that letter that I was describing, and some engraving, I think, but I actually can't quite tell here. So that invitation, that openness, that sense of how one could be a human being in the fullest sense of the word, and that only enhanced what you did. That was one of the object lessons that I drew from that experience of working with Richard. And I'll say also, one of the things that I admire about this is that the printed picture, as you mentioned, it started as lectures that he was giving when he was teaching at Yale. It then became a wonderful book. Alan Chasnoff actually recorded a series of lectures that you can still get on the, I think it's on the Yale Art Gallery website. But he also was really thinking about how these things ought to live and be experienced in an exhibition, which is another track that not everyone thinks through. And so to do that, I remember him bringing in these enlargements, each one at something like 200% of the original. And, this was at a moment when the technologies to do this were still evolving, but he was pushing them from the very start. And he understood that in order to really grasp the nuances of what he was helping us learn through this exhibition, that these enlarged details would help a broad audience do that really almost at a glance. And so this installation view also shows that. But it was a real privilege to get to know him and work with him on this. I won't forget it.
And just to build on what you said, Sarah, I believe the enlargements you're talking about are the images on the wall in this view that are higher than the others, right?
Yes,
placed
thank you.
directly above,
Exactly.
above the prints that they represent.
Exactly. Thank you. So there's a few things that were framed. There's an Albers that's framed on that wall. Then there are a few things that are put in sort of plexiglass sandwiches. And then at the top, on that higher register, are the enlargements of the objects below them to help you understand exactly how they were made, where pressure was applied or material was removed or how the image comes together.
So, so we really see Benson's teaching methods here. Not only does this reflect the subjects that he taught in his classes, but as we mentioned, these were actually the objects in this show were actually his teaching materials. He made them directly into a book, which starts not with the beginnings of photography, but with the beginnings of imagery with hands-on cave walls, as Sarah said, but really takes us through the history of printed images from the earliest, woodcuts and things all the way up until 2008. Benson always wanted to push on the future, to knock on the door of the future. So it ends right where the book ends. But it's an amazing survey, and the format is wonderful because he usually just has one or two spreads with an image and some details, and some number of paragraphs about every process. And it's actually a great object lesson to learn about how all these.
Oh, actually, can I say one more thing about the object lesson? Is one of the joys of coming down to see your exhibition, which was so beautiful, and to go to Tilt and to see the exhibition object lesson there, was that Sarah Stolfa, who's the director of Tilt, also remarked on that same thing. So here, two Sarahs who understood Richard from two, she had been a student of his, we had never met. And yet it turned out that both of our contributions for the book in different ways remarked upon this idea of imbuing your work with your life. And that, and others in the book actually in different ways also did the same. So hi, Sarah, thanks for joining us. And definitely that show is also a joy.
It is. Let's go to the next slide, please. We don't dwell too much further on all the books that Richard made. He was involved, it should be said, however, in many of the great photo books that have been printed and published over the past 50 years. For instance, he worked with Lee Friedlander on many of Friedlander's titles, especially early ones like American Monument and other related images, related books and titles. He also, his work on books extended into the early 2000s. It's a little known fact, he also did the separations for Madonna's book, Sex. I don't have slides to show that today, but just to give you a sense.
It's on view at Tilt and you can actually touch it. So that's pretty great.
Yeah, there are some things at Tilt that you can handle that we have in cases at PMA. Two different places. So it's nice because Benson always wanted people to be able to hold books and photographs in their hands. That was important to him. I'm just showing you here an image and the cover from Benson's first book, his own book, Lay This Laurel, which is an extraordinary book of photographs of the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, which is a wonderful monument on Boston Common, designed by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. And this monument it's a monument to one heroic white man, Robert Gould Shaw, who was a leader in the Union Army during the Civil War. But it's also a monument to the Black Regiment of soldiers who fought with him, and many of whom died with him in battle. And it's one of St. Gaudens' great achievements. Benson got involved with it because one of his great friends and patrons in life was the publisher Leslie Katz, who founded the Akins Press Foundation in New York City. Katz and Benson worked together on many projects over the years, and Katz, they shared, I should say, a real devotion to social justice for Black Americans. And Katz was concerned because the St. Gaudens Memorial did not include the names of any of the soldiers who were depicted. It's fictional depictions, but the names of the real people were not included. And he wanted to make a book that would correct that in part. He found a real soulmate in Benson, I think, because they both cared so much about American democracy. They thought about it, I think, really in philosophical terms, and about the ideals of our political system, and a real love for the culture of our country, for the art and literature and everything else that was made. So this was Benson's first book from 1973. And if you've seen the movie Glory, it's based on the sculpture, just like the book is. But I think as much as I love the movie, the book is better. And this image on the left is just one image from it. So I think we've given you a good sense of Benson's involvement with books and his commitment to them. And why don't we go to the next slide? Now, in his photography, Benson was purposely wide-ranging. He would have insisted, he did insist to me at one point, that he was a very busy man, and he photographed what he could photograph in his life. So he photographed the world around him, his home, his family, his friends, things that caught his interest. He was curious about a lot, and so there is a lot in his pictures. But I think it was very important to him not to kind of delimit his subject matter. The world was there to be photographed, and sort of, in his view, I think, demanded to be photographed and recorded and engaged with through the camera. And he did that. And these are two pictures that I love, that I think were also important to him, just to give you a sense of how wide-ranging his subjects were. On the left is a picture he made on a trip to Puerto Rico. He and his wife and family traveled to Puerto Rico many, many times over the years, and he would go out photographing. He found this hulk of machinery, antique machinery, in a field, and recognized it immediately as a steam engine. I would not have known, had I driven by it, what it was, but Benson, among his enthusiasms, was steam engines. And he recognized this one as an early version of the leading steam engine of the Industrial Revolution from the 18th century, invented by a man named Watt, and who was Scots. And so this is Benson's title for it, the Scottish engine. And he then would have been able to tell you, if you were looking at this picture with him, all about the history of small sugar plantations in Puerto Rico, of which there were dozens and dozens in the 19th century. And he knew that this would have been a leftover from one of those. He photographed it, of course, on a beautiful day in the landscape. On the right is a really intimate, very arbitrary picture, right? But that's his daughter, Sarah, his firstborn child, asleep in her car seat on what looks like a summer day in New England. And I put this on the back cover of our book because I love it so much. It speaks to what Sarah was just saying, Sarah Meister, about the sort of bringing your whole life into your work, and your work into your life, as one of the object lessons that she gained from Richard. He really did, his family was just a part of everything else, including his photography. But the angle of this picture, I think, speaks to both the trepidation and the love that parents feel for their kids, especially in these sleepy moments. I should add that Anmi Lee, the artist, who was also a student of Benson's, wrote an essay for our book, for our exhibition, a wonderful essay, and she talks at length about this photograph. And Anmi, I don't know if you're here, but your words about it have really prompted me to care about it even more. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? Now, Benson's work changed over time. It changed quite a lot, as we will all see. But it was prompted by forces that other people weren't thinking about so much, and that's mainly by technology. I mentioned his love of steam engines. Benson really was fascinated by technology, and he thought about it deeply and at length. And he thought about it in terms of human history, and then even beyond that in terms of world history. So that's kind of always bubbling in his work, technology and what you can do with it and where it's going. But it goes backwards and forwards with him. He was interested in the newest things, but also in old-fashioned ways of doing things. He always learned by doing, and he wanted to master processes. That's why, you know, the printed picture, which is about every print process he had ever heard of, is in part, it stems from his curiosity to know how all of them worked. When he worked on the Gilman Paper Company book that we were oohing and eyeing over a few minutes ago, after he had really, it took him all those years to master the offset process and tinker with it to make it into this artisanal thing that allowed that book to happen. Well, once he had gotten there, he was so excited by the reproductions that he had made that he decided to print his own photographs that way. And keep in mind that, you know, most of the nice posters that we all have from the 1980s and 90s were made by offset lithography. So this really was a workaday process, albeit with some great potential. But Benson just pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. And he actually told me that he was particularly proud of his offset prints from his photographs. He really thought they were great. And I agree with him. We have about 15 of them up in the exhibition. And these are two. Now, one thing.
Peter, do you just want to clarify the titles of these pictures? I don't think they're right in the.
Oh gosh. No, they're not.
They were actually right when we previewed it. So
Yeah.
it was right previously. So something changed, but you just may want to, I'm not sure exactly what the titles are, but they're definitely not.
Thank you.
Both Christopher
No.
Benson.
We saw Christopher Benson earlier in the talk. The young man on the left is Michael Page, who was a family friend and neighbor of the Bensons. I believe he's sitting on the Benson's front porch. And the photograph on the right is titled Memphis, and Benson is under one of the great bridges crossing the river in Memphis. And of course, he's letting us see another bridge next door. And these are both from the mid-1980s, the photographs themselves, just to be clear. Sorry for that technical glitch, everybody.
Good, it's a reminder, we're all human. It's good.
So,
even with all the computers.
Yeah. So I mentioned that Benson used a view camera. He was very devoted to the 8x10 view camera from the 1960s, using negatives the same of that size, 8x10 inches. And he generally wanted to make contact prints from those when he was printing in the darkroom, making gelatin silver prints or platinum prints. Because as many other people felt, you know, he really believed firmly that you got the most detail and the most ocular clarity from that large format printing, that contact printing. But there were two things about this that frustrated him. One was that he really wanted to be able to print photographs in ink, and that goes back to his work with books. I think he loved the way ink looked on a page, and so it was a personal thing, but also, you know, he felt that was the natural way for photography to go in order to be a viable medium, because chemical prints are so fugitive. And he also, of course, wanted to make bigger pictures. Photographers always want to be able to print a little bit bigger. And switching to this offset process allowed him to enlarge these pictures quite a bit without really losing any detail. So these pictures are almost twice as big as his contact prints that he would have made in the dark room. So he was very excited by that. And you see his subject matter continuing. I didn't realize it until this moment, but I showed you a machine and a person in the last set of slides, and here we have a person and a piece of engineering. So those are the most important themes in his work in some ways. Why don't we go to the next slide? Now, for something completely different. When digital photography hit the airwaves, hit the public in the early 1990s, most photographers of Benson's generation, he was born in '43, most photographers of that generation were not only skeptical, but they had almost an allergic reaction to digital photography, and not without reason. Early digital photography was crude, and the prints were often pretty ugly to look at. Sarah, I hope you agree, as a former curator. And Benson understood all of that, but he was not the least bit worried about it because his love of technology just took over, and he was mesmerized by what computers could do. I think he also, his son Daniel was just at the age where he could absorb every new change in computer technology and spit it back out, and that had a big influence on Benson as well. So he was excited about computers, and he understood that digital photography was only going to get better. Just like the steam engine I showed earlier, he knew that that was one in many, many, many iterations of steam engines that kept getting better and better and better over time. And he understood that that would happen with digital technology as well. Of course, he set about dealing with it, not in a corporate way, but in an artisanal way. And he started tinkering with inkjet printers and fooling around with cameras. And by the early 2000s, he was really happy about where digital photography had gotten and where he had gotten it. And he switched entirely to working with digital cameras and to making pictures like these in color. And the switch to color, I think, was as powerful and meaningful for him as the switch to digital had been or was. Benson said again and again, that the logic of digital photography was really fundamentally different from analog because it revolved around color as opposed to black and white and the grayscale. And he also constantly mentioned that, color photography's origins were with advertising. And so I think this kind of gave him permission to embrace the gaudy American worlds that we all live in that's just full of visual noise. He always loved that world, I think. He was very skeptical of color photography before digital, but with digital and the fact that, guess what, digital prints are made with ink, his true love in printing, he just went to the races and had an amazing decade of making this work. This is also a period when he started traveling a lot. He was on road trips. And Sarah, you can probably speak about this as much as I can, but with his friends, Lee Friedlander and John Jarkowski and John Childs, he would make trips every year. They would go on photo trips. I think he was still in film when those trips started, but made the shift early on to digital. And then when he retired from Yale in 2006, he and Barbara had a camper van, the Giraffe, and they traveled extensively. So he really started making road trip pictures like these. And the titles and dates here are correct. We have Wyoming on the left and Georgia on the right. Now, I won't say too much detail about Benson's printing, but one thing he was excited about. So this idea that you can print the same sheet of a picture more than once was very important to him. Again, it came out of his work on books with duotone printing. He used it in the offset process for those black and white works we just saw, and he wanted to apply it to digital inkjet printing as well. So he would print each of these pictures multiple times. He settled, I think, on 3 times as usually ideal for an inkjet print. But he wrote about the fact that he could print the blacks separately from the colors in these pictures. And in his words, that really opened the pictures up so that instead of a film coating of gray or black everywhere in the scene, the blacks were really contained to where they were in the image. And that really allowed the colors to pop and sort of hold their own. And you see that in these pictures. And I have to say that Benson's prints, such as these two, are really unlike prints that almost anybody else was making in the early 2000s. They are really extraordinary. They're just kind of crystalline and popping with color, and they're really amazing to stand in front of and see. And if we go to the next slide, you can talk about that, Sarah.
Sorry. So yeah, this is one of my favorites of his color photographs. Apples for John is an allusion to John Charkowski, who was one of the people on the road trips that you described. John was the longtime director of the Department of Photography at MoMA, But in 1991, when he stepped down from that position, he resumed his career as a photographer. So for 30 years, he really hadn't made pictures. He had been focusing on tending to other people's pictures. And so this photograph was made, 2007, I'm going to guess late 2007. John Cherkowski passed away in July of 2007. And he, and this is an homage to him, both in the sense of John bred apples at his country home. So he was, both John and Richard would know the name of what it meant to be somebody who bred apples. I can't, I'm blanking on it. So someone help me out here. But there's a word for somebody who's very serious about how you get certain breeds of apples, and they both knew it for sure. But also this is a nice, speaking to the era of the contact prints that you're mentioning, you know, both John Cherkowski, of course, but Richard Benson equally were, their vision was anchored in a sense of photo history. And so for anyone who is that embedded in that history, Atget's photographs of apples, or at Alfred Stieglitz's photographs of apples and Gables, Lake George, these would be pictures that would be in their sort of shared lexicon of images. And in part, it's what makes that evolution from the contact prints into these explosive, riotous digital color pictures so dramatic, and you know, that Richard could hold these two things with equal esteem. That idea of, you know, what a perfectly rendered contact print could be, and then what happens when you try to apply the same seriousness of looking to a new technology and a new opportunity. And that, I think, is what he's doing here. And we, Richard chose this as the frontispiece for the printed picture book. So this is when you open that book, this is the first photograph you see there.
And I'll just add that the fact that he loved both the consumer world that I was showing you a few, you know, in the previous slide, and the natural world, and that he found ways to represent both, I think, equally powerfully in this color work is also, to me, pretty exciting. Now let's go to the next slide, because this work did result in a book, another wonderful book published by the Museum of Modern Art, with an essay by Peter Galassi, who worked very closely with Benson on it. There's a wonderful essay by Peter in the book that talks about this work. And I have a confession in my own essay in the new book that we have. I got a few facts slightly wrong about this book. So apologies to Peter Galassi and to everyone else. And I should have known better, because, you know, one of the legends when you study the history of photography, or one of the things you learn, is that Walker Evans' great book, American Photographs from 1938, he took all the photographs, but the amazing layout and ordering of pictures that everybody loves was put together by his friend Lincoln Kirsten. And the same was the case with this book. I had an exchange with Peter the other day, and he told me that he ordered the plates in this book.
Meaning sequenced them, sorry, just in case.
Yes, he sequenced, so he chose the ordering of images. And he did so from about 200 pictures that Benson approved and sent to him. So Benson said, here's a group of pictures, you decide what ones to include and where to put them. And I think Peter did an amazing job. And you know, Peter Galassi talked in depth with Richard about his thinking about technology. I should say that in the years that Benson was working on these pictures, he was actually writing a treatise on technology. In his free time. Well, I mean, really, it's pretty extraordinary. Now, nobody has ever seen this because he self-published it, and there are only about 15 copies. I have one on loan that I'm lucky to look at. But the first iteration was called Me and Moki. Moki was his dog. Note the bad grammar, the intentional bad grammar in the title. And it is his thinking, his musings about the whole history of technology, and the fact that human beings are not the key actors in that history. We're not we're not driving the bus. We might be driving it briefly right now, but we're really just like worker bees, in his words. And we're facilitating a much bigger story than the one we think we're writing. That in a nutshell, that was his thinking about technology. But Peter Galassi really captures that in this book, because it's sort of like a road trip book, like American Photographs or like Robert Frank's later book, The Americans. But instead of really just being about this country or about one place, it's really about geologic time, the way that Peter Galassi organized it. So, which is very much in tune with Benson's thinking. So that we start, these are 3 spreads from near the beginning, the middle, and the end of the book. We start with rocks and sea. You find yourself in the middle of the country with agriculture, sort of one of the first human industries, several pages of that. And then we gradually make our way to the world of, what I've been calling the flotsam and jetsam of consumer life. It's hard to see a little bit, but that picture on the right on the bottom is the front of an RV with this amazing installation of Barbie dolls who are doing hula dances and having all kinds of other confabs on the dashboard of that RV. And that's the kind of subject it's one of the kinds of subjects that Richard Benson really loved, and something that I really appreciate in his work.
Yeah, I think if I just chime in, it's interesting his affection for sort of what I think both for photography and democracy, like kind of what a mess they both are, how riotous and unruly and all this. And it's like both in photography and in democracy, there's this ideal that you aspire to, but then there's like, how do you actually make it work? And the never end, the changing nature of these things, I think, something when I see a picture like that, it becomes a kind of metaphor for bigger things about that I'm sure Richard was thinking of at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think you put it really, really well. That the sort of conflation of democracy and photography, he did love them both, and wanted them both to be as big and wide tent as possible, Now, I see we have not gotten all the way through our slides, but we're at the point when our audience should be invited to speak with us. So, Lynnea, how about if we just quickly zip through the rest of the pictures, because I just want people to be able to see these photographs. Yeah. We can just keep cycling through them. Here's more technology, but in a very fun version in an amusement park.
I did notice, Peter, that Elizabeth Kahana is on the chat. I don't know if you want to mention anything about how these pictures ended up at Philadelphia, or how most of the pictures in the show.
Yeah, I do.
It's actually a really nice story.
Portrait. Yeah. So Elizabeth Kahana is a friend of both Aperture's and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She and her husband, Bill, are wonderful photography collectors. Elizabeth is a photographer. And they were drawn into the Richard Benson magic, like so many others. And about the time that I was, actually. And Richard met me and he met them, and I wanted some photographs for the museum, and I didn't know it, but Benson wanted that too. In fact, he wanted examples of all of the different processes he'd printed in to sort of be together. There's a group like that at Yale, and MoMA, of course, has wonderful things, but he wanted one more group somewhere else. And Elizabeth and Bill very gamely offered to acquire well over 100 photographs by Benson. I think it's 190. He kept adding to the group at the end, so the number kept going up. But Bill and Elizabeth purchased that and have promised it to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and that's the basis of our exhibition. So thank you, Elizabeth and Bill.
Well, and thank you both for that really great introduction. And I'm sorry to kind of rush you at the end, but of course, we are opening up for questions. We can go back to some of those slides we just flipped through if we need to. So at this time, for anyone out there who has a question, now is your moment to put it in the Q&A box. Just a reminder, if you see a question that you want to hear answered, you can give it a thumbs up and that'll send it to the top of the queue. And while people are formulating their questions, Sarah, in answer to your question, we have some guesses about what you call a person who breeds apples, a cultivar, a botanist, a pomologist and an orchidist have all been suggested.
All right, all right.
So maybe
those aren't exactly what I'm thinking of, but those all helpfully point in that direction. So much appreciated. A little hive mind. So yes, I mean, that was one of the amazing things, is that Richard's ability to both remember a detail but to make it matter was something that I think he and John and Peter Galassi actually all held in common. So it wasn't just that you were hearing a story that included some details that stretched far beyond what it seemed any human being should know, be able to grasp all that, but also saying it in a simple enough way that even a lay person could grasp the core of it. And more than that, helping you care about something. You know, I had never really cared so much about engraving or calligraphy, or frankly, even printing processes until I encountered Richard, and that gift for making accessible arcane corners of our shared human sense of progress. That was very valuable and instructive to me.
Great. You know, we have some questions coming in, but first, if I may, I would like to ask a question, which is that exhibitions like this often look back over the career of an artist, and perhaps you see an evolution over time. One of the things I see is a switch to color, from black and white to color. But I wonder if, other than that, you see major changes, or perhaps returning to some of the same concerns.
You know, I'll go first, and I'll just say that I think Benson was remarkably consistent in his career. In his, you know, as I said earlier, he really wanted to embrace his whole world, and anything he was curious about merited a photograph, is the way that I would put it. But one thing I've noticed is that he focused a lot on monuments and other people's art in some of his work. The St. Gaudens Memorial is an example. We didn't say this, but he came from a wonderful family of stone carvers himself. And so stone carving features in a lot of his work. And historic buildings are something he photographed a lot. But once he switched to color, that didn't go away entirely. But he was, I think, so engaged with the way that color is in the world that he wasn't so focused on subjects like those. A great example is the image that's on the screen. This is one of my favorite photographs by him, and it's a taco place in Texas. And that wonderful patterning at the top of the building that you see is just black and white license plates with one red license plate. So somebody has decorated their space. And this was a motif for Benson actually all the way through. He was always drawn to living rooms and living spaces. He wrote about them in his treatise on technology, in fact. And what he loved about them was the way that people sort of shape a world for themselves, even if it's just a private retreat. You know, this is a public little building, but it's full of character, and that's, I think, why he wanted to photograph it. Sarah?
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, I think the history of photography, more than any other medium that we consider art, although whether that's a capacious enough description for photography is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, but its whole history is marked by a series of technological changes. And I think in part, Richard's ability to understand the promise of what digital technologies meant emerged from his comfort with and grasp of each preceding evolution in the history of the medium, from daguerreotypes and salted paper prints through wet collodion negatives into gelatin film and dry plates. And this whole idea, so once you have made peace with that, you understand that photography is continually characterized by this evolution, then what the future brings is no longer has to be scary. So you draw from those past experiences and you say, okay, it wasn't the death of photography once everyone held a Kodak camera in their hand, nor will it be the death of photography when digital technologies emerge. But in the hands of a talented few, you can actually push these technologies forward and improve understanding with and engagement around their possibilities. And so I think it's both a kind of an echo of the past, but it's definitely the push is forward looking and forward thinking. So it's not just a repetition.
Yeah, I would add that at the end of his life, Benson was determined to just be done with printing altogether. I mean, here he devoted his life to print, and in my view was, you know, probably one of the most skilled technicians in printing in its entire 1,000-year history. And he was ready to say goodbye to them because he felt that computer monitors had gotten to such a level of quality that the images you could get on a monitor were better than anything that anybody could print. And
Wow.
he was joyous about this, you know, and fearless. But what's interesting, he had started to tinker. He had a program he called the Contraption, which unfortunately was, you know, it wasn't worked out enough to include in our exhibition, for example. But he was putting his images onto a program to be shown on a screen. But he also scanned earlier work that he cared about. He scanned Henri Cartier-Bresson's book, The Decisive Moment, from cover to cover. And he scanned a bunch of Atget negatives or images that he had. And I was so confused by that when I was looking at this program. I was thinking, why did he, you know, do these things? And I finally realized it speaks to just what you said, Sarah. He was excited that all of the past that he cared about could be put onto the Noah's Ark of digital technology and carried forward. And that just thrilled him. So that's sort of where he was at that point.
Wow. I mean, well, that's a wonderful attitude to bring to life, maybe. We have a question from Barbara Greenberg, who asks, can you speak to his wonderful landscapes that don't have an element of technology in them?
I don't know that we have a slide of any of those here.
Oh, we had the apple, you know, the apple tree.
We had the apples.
The first spread of the north, south, east, west. That was a landscape without. How about those?
Correct.
I'll let you speak to them. I'll just tell you where the slides are.
Thank you. Well, we could go back to the apples for sure. So, so Benson loved landscape photography, actually, and he practiced it throughout his career. And, you know, for him, he often, you know, he wasn't ever trying to be an avant-garde artist or cutting edge. He really, there was so much satisfaction for him in learning how other people had done things, and then moving forward from that point, that he did make a lot of traditional landscapes, and they're often just mesmerizing because they're so beautifully printed. I haven't thought about them much beyond that, you know, other than, you know, I think about it in terms of him. I think it's like a jazz musician who learns the standards, right? He wanted to learn how the other great photographs had been made. The Paul Strand irises that are at the very end of our reel here demonstrate.
And actually, Lynnea, maybe you'll read the question out loud that it's about those while we bring them up.
Yeah,
it's like 3 slides forward, I think. So.
I will. And the question is from Dale Parenti, who asks, can you talk about the pairing of the Paul Strand print and Benson's print? Paul Strand has much warmer tones.
So thank you, Dale, for that question. And the warmer tones are immediately visible, and that's because the Strand print on the left is a platinum print made in the 1920s. So it's had a long time to age, but it's also made with platinum and some gold toning, probably to give it that sepia color. And the image on the right by Benson is a gelatin silver print. The reason we put these into the talk here is that Benson, actually working for Aperture, spent 3 summers with Strand at the end of Strand's life, making prints for portfolios that Aperture was producing, which is one of the great photo projects of the 1970s, I think. And when I talked to Benson about this is actually why I met Benson, because I was working on a project about Strand, and I went to interview him about Strand. This is how generous he was. He met with me for a whole day to talk about another artist's work. That sums up a lot about Richard Benson. But he told me that when he first got to Orgeval, where Strand lived, they spent a couple of weeks just opening every box of prints that Strand had and looking at every print. And that, I think Benson probably enjoyed that as much as Strand did, because he was such a deep observer, and not just of life, but of prints. And he really absorbed a lot from looking at other people's work, at other photographs. And he has written about Strand's prints long before I ever met him. And he wrote about the fact that Strand, what he really respected about Strand was that Strand, insisted on good prints. But he wasn't, he also understood that that's a very subjective thing to say, right? You can't make a scientific equation for what a good print is going to be from any negative. It's a very subjective process to make one. And therefore, two great prints like these two can look quite different from each other.
Great, thank you. A question that I, as somebody who does not know much about photography, does not fully understand. Warren Williams asks, did Benson's use of ink make display somewhat less problematic because of less light exposure?
I mean, Peter, you can try. Well, my brief answer to that is that yes, inks, papers may not be less susceptible to the vagaries of environmental change and light, but inks certainly are less than materials that are sensitive to light, like the photographic materials. But I think to say that he was interested in it because it was less light sensitive is maybe not quite the most direct path pointing toward his interest. So in his mind, I think he saw the challenge. And actually, Peter, I have a slightly different, in my mind, Richard's engagement with printing photographs was like, how do you take this material that allows you to make a gorgeous continuous tone as a photographic print does, and how do you wrangle a very workaday ink on paper process, which the offset printing process was before Benson, and how do you use that process and the multiple passes through the press and all of the other separating out of the various tones? How do you use that process to actually approximate or even match the beauty of whether it's a gelatin silver print or a platinum print or a palladium print? So I think that it was nice that they were less fugitive, but I don't think that was why he was interested in ink on paper. It was like he set himself the challenge of making an ink on paper print that could match the best qualities of a photographic print. How's that?
I agree with you.
I agree with you.
I agree.
How's that for a theory?
And I would add a subjective twist to it, however, because Benson, he didn't like working in the darkroom, and this comes out every once in a while. And it's not. I mean, some photographers don't like the darkroom because it's lonely. He didn't like it because he didn't have enough control. And John Goodman, actually, who's a great printer, explained this to me when I interviewed him about Benson. He worked with Benson, and he said, Benson's thinking all comes out of the half-tone dot. And what he meant was that, Benson started in this world with books. He went to Meriden Gravure and he was there to print books, and he learned how to make these ink prints. And he loved the amount of control, by which I mean tinkering, right? When you're printing something with ink and you're printing it more than once, you can keep tinkering and building it. And Benson loved that ability to build a picture. And I think that's why he loved ink more than
okay. I'm persuaded.
Everything you said is also true. It's there's never one answer with Benson. There are always multiple reasons, but he whatever reason he might throw at the question in a given day, he liked printing in ink the most.
Quick question. We got a question in the chat. What is offset printing? So if there's a concise answer to that.
I'm terrible at this. This is why I'm a curator and not a printer.
All right, do you want me to give it a try? All
yes,
right, I'll throw, here's my 30-second version of offset printing.
Yeah.
In the history of printing processes, as they're outlined in the printing picture, most prints are made in contact with a matrix. And in that contact with the matrix, whether it's an engraving or a lithograph or whatever it might be, that it wears down that original matrix. And so that's why when you have a print, usually, you know, early ones in the edition are more highly valued than later. Well, actually dependent, forget it. I didn't say that because it depends on the artist. Some of them like the degrading, but what offset allowed was for a transfer of that matrix to offset it, which meant that you could, at least in theory, have an infinite number of identical prints from an image source. And so for a book or a newspaper, or, you know, it was common, it was offset printing for text happened much earlier than offset printing because, well, various ways the images are formed. But I think that's the heart of it, is that it didn't require contact. It was sort of, they went through the printer in different directions as opposed to in the same direction. And so historically it had been a less valuable, less desired, less controllable process. But Richard certainly changed that. How's that? What do you think?
That's pretty good. That's pretty
Excellent.
good.
By the way, I'm positive that if Leanne Daphner, MoMA's photo conservator, were watching this, she would smack me on the hand and say that was terrible. But anyway, I tried, and certainly Richard.
Curators are like politicians when you ask us to explain technical processes, right? It's
Yeah.
But you did a good job.
I tried. I wish Richard were here. I wish Richard were here for 1,000,008 reasons.
He could explain
but that would be one of them. Yeah.
Well, I see we have the thank you slide up, and indeed we're past 1 o'clock, but if you'll, maybe I'll ask one more question and then we'll wrap it up, if that
we'll go quickly.
suits you both. Anthony Scatz asks, other than Madonna, are there other musicians or authors, etc., that ask Benson to do work for them, such as album or book covers? Second question, do you think that would have been too much of like an advertisement for his liking?
Well, I'll answer them in order as I understand them. I not that I know of. And Madonna was not, I don't think she approached Benson directly. A wonderful publisher whose name is jumping out of my head right now, I can't remember, somebody that I interviewed for this project, was a publisher that worked with Benson. Nicholas
Callaway?
Nicholas Callaway, thank you. Worked closely with Madonna on more than one of her books, and he had known Benson for years. So that's how that happened. I think Benson was excited by that project, as he would be by many others. I don't know that he did work with other musicians or artists of that sort. He very well may have. And I don't think that I don't think he would have been opposed to such work, but I will say that as his career advanced and he was able to secure more and more time for himself to make his own work, that became the priority, thankfully, because that's what led to the extraordinary road trips and color photography that is really like, it's only 10 years of his career, but it's kind of like half of everything. And it's an extraordinary half. So it was really at that point in his life just about making time for himself and all the pictures he still wanted to make.
Great, well, thank you. And I will just echo all the many thanks that were coming in the chat to both you and Sarah, for your insights, for this lovely conversation. It's really a pleasure. So thank you both.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And of course, I mean, thanks to all of you out there who joined us today. We're so grateful to have you with us. We appreciate those of you who donated when you registered for this program, to our members, but primarily we're just glad to share this space with you. We hope to see you again soon. So I'm going to ask you to save the date because our next program is on November 18th. It's a panel of artists from many disciplines who will be talking about Jasper Johns. So please, we'd love to see you for that. When you close out of your browser, a survey will pop up. There'll also be a link to the survey in the chat. Give us your feedback. It helps make these programs better for you. Yeah. And with that, just I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you all.
Thank you, Lynnea, and thank you, Peter, for such a beautiful show and for your partnership with Sarah Stolfa and Aperture. So we're happy to all be honoring Richard together.
Yes, we are. Thank you for joining us from Madrid, Sarah Meister. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. I love all the comments and questions. It's really nice to get that feedback. So everybody have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.